think anytime you're served a good dose of disappointment, you should give yourself the space to be angry about it until you ultimately get over that and start to look at it with a clearer perspective. What is this telling me? What can I learn from it?
We are so glad that you've joined us today, and we're particularly glad to welcome Will Guidara. I am Sally Halderson, Managing Director at Porchlight Book Company. And I usually do a little introduction here to get us all warmed up. And so I'm going to begin with some promises. The first thing you'll get from Will in his new book, Unreasonable Hospitality, is a business industry story. And here at Porchlight, we love industry stories. And really, culturally, there are few industries that intrigue us as much as the restaurant industry. Perhaps it's because it's at its base, a restaurant is about food, about feeding people, a thing so basic that it is primary to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But the allure, the differentiation comes from the how the food is prepared, how it's served, in what atmosphere, with what flair. And that's the second thing you'll get from Unreasonable Hospitality, the how. Each restaurant, each chef, each service team's unique approach that at its best can draw people in, turn first-timers into regulars, requires commitment to a vision, a willingness to take risks, and a lot of hard, exacting work. Will has done that work and brought his goal of creating the very best restaurant in the world to life. And in Unreasonable Hospitality, he also shows us how we can apply those same ambitious standards and leadership techniques that can vastly improve how we treat people, whether it's our customers or our employees or each other. Hi, Will. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for this really excellent book.
Hey, I'm so thrilled to be here with you. And I also really liked that opening. That was very nice.
Thanks. We can commit to those things, right? We can commit to this book working on all of those different levels.
Yeah, 100%. I'm sold. I would like a copy of the book. You've sold me.
Excellent. That's what I'm here for. So we hope that at the end of this conversation, not only will people get a sense of what the book is, but also get really excited about what they can learn in it. And if we can start broadly, and I'm going to give you some questions and let you riff on what you know best. I've been in the retail service industry for somewhere around 27 years or something like that. And I would wager most people who are on this call, or just in life in general, have worked a service job at some point in their working lives. And of course, everyone's been a recipient of good or bad service. There's a big audience out there for your message about why and how service is different from hospitality. Can you tell us the difference and why that difference is so important to the success of a business?
Yeah, so I do think there's a very, very big difference, and spending time understanding that difference, and as a culture deciding how you're going to prioritize your efforts once you have an understanding of that difference really dictates the kind of operation you're running, because it's the appropriate filter through which you start to make decisions. Mm-hmm. Service is the thing that you do, right? In a restaurant, service is delivering the right plate to the right person within the right amount of time, doing it efficiently and as accurately as possible. Hospitality is how you make the person feel when you do that. One of the things I used to do when I was coming up and I was a young manager is I would have all these interview questions that I would ask people. I wasn't yet a very confident interviewer, and so I needed to have these locked and loaded questions ready to go. And one of the ones that I liked the most was, what is the difference between service and hospitality? And the best answer I ever got was that service is black and white and hospitality is color. Mm-hmm. When you add hospitality to your business, it's like that scene in The Wizard of Oz when everything goes technicolor. It goes from transactional to connective. There's this famous quote often attributed to Maya Angelou, which I believe is the best quote ever written about hospitality. People will forget what you say, they'll forget what you do, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And we can all relate to that, I'm sure. Service is what you do. Hospitality is how you make the person feel.
I have about 4 different questions I can go off on from that answer alone, talking about what is transactional and what is not, and how this book is about empathy and all of these sorts. But in order to prime us for exploring all of these themes in the book, can you talk a little bit about your biography, essentially how you came up in the restaurant industry, and how you excelled, and what position or perspective you're looking at your experience now, so that everyone understands how you're reflecting upon the journey you took.
Yeah, so I grew up in the restaurant business. My dad was a lifelong restaurateur. My dad was kind of my hero growing up. So it honestly didn't matter what he did. That's the thing that I would have wanted to do. Right. Just so happened that I fell in love with the thing that he did. I was always enamored with restaurants when I'd go to work with him. Anyone who knows anyone that works in restaurants, the hours are quite extreme. And so if you want to spend time with your dad's in the restaurant business, you go to work with him. There was something about spending time in the dining rooms of those restaurants. They had this energy where for everyone that was in them, like a great restaurant, what it does is it creates the conditions for connection. If you and I were to go to a great restaurant, the idea is that at the end of it, we should be closer to one another than we were when we walked in the door. I believe a great restaurant understands that the food, the service, and the design are merely ingredients in the recipe of human connection. And I felt that at an early age, to the point where there was nothing else I wanted to do with my life. Mm-hmm. I went to Cornell, to the hotel school. I worked for Danny Meyer, one of the great restaurateurs in the history of America. His book was certainly the one that set the foundation for mine. His book is on Setting the Table. I worked with him for a while at a restaurant called Tabla. I went to another company called Restaurant Associates, where I kind of got my business school and boot camp all in one. I was in charge of purchasing and then accounting before returning to work with Danny. And I ran the restaurant at the Museum of Modern Art before going to 11 Madison Park, which I ultimately ended up buying from Danny with my then partner. When we bought 11 Madison Park, it was a beautiful, popular restaurant. The room that 11 Madison Park is in is quite extraordinary, but the restaurant itself was kind of a mediocre brasserie. By the time I sold my company in early 2020, just before COVID, we had been named the best restaurant in the world, along with a bunch of other accolades. And we opened hotels and other restaurants along the way. But I sold my company then, and then COVID hit. And timing. Yeah, I know. That was not due to some prescient understanding of the pending disaster of the world. Yeah. No. And, I'd wanted to write a book for some time because I feel very fortunate that I've worked with some amazing people and for some amazing mentors. And I've learned a lot of lessons that I feel could be helpful to people in restaurants and outside of restaurants. COVID not only gave me the grace and the space and the time to actually sit down and write a book, but it also, what I was experiencing and what so many people that I know and love were experiencing, made the power of hospitality feel more important than ever before, because what people were missing so dramatically was connection. Right. People didn't stop buying things, right? Oh. People just missed that feeling of connection with either their loved ones or even with strangers, right? That is what makes us human. And I believe now, coming out of that season in our collective experience, that everyone, as individuals and as businesses, with the people in our lives, those that we work with and those that we serve, choosing to prioritize connection, how we make people feel, giving people a sense of belonging, making people feel welcome, and to pursue that with the same recklessness and relentlessness that so many people pursue the things that they make, is the thing that will separate the great ones from the pack.
And I think one of the things that comes very clearly through your book is establishing that is very difficult, right? Like it's a challenge that I think we'll see escalate as we talk through the book. But I think what I'd like to actually sort of jump on here is this idea of reinvention, and that we all experienced by force, I guess, through COVID. And I think no other industry at the time really intrigued all of us as much as what are restaurants doing in reaction to COVID. And that you could, if you're a business geek, if you're a transformation geek, if you like innovation, if you like all of this, then you're really intrigued by what this particular industry that relies on connection, on people locating in the same place, when that's taken away, how are they going to survive? And so I'm curious to know what you think it is about the very best restaurants that did survive, what they did. Like, what is the essence of that community that works in a restaurant from the top to the bottom? What is it that allowed those restaurants to survive this great forced change?
Well, I think it's interesting. I think there's two kind of buckets of restaurants and how they weathered the storm that was COVID. I think there were some restaurants that kind of had gotten lost a little bit in the years leading up to COVID, where, listen, the thing that's happened over the last 10, 15 years in restaurants, which is very exciting and very additive to our community, has also been damaging in a way, which is that there's been such a focus on ratings and lists and all this stuff that
right.
I think some restaurants have stopped doing what they do in pursuit of people and started doing it in pursuit of their egos. Early in COVID, during those Zooms, right? Not dissimilar to the one we're on right now.
Right.
Like people, friends, family would get together because they were just craving connection with their loved ones. And, you'd get the text with whatever group and they'd be like, let's get on a Zoom Tuesday at 7:00. And you just get on with no agenda, but people just wanted to feel connected. I was on one of the Zooms and a friend of mine who's a pastor in Washington State joined, and he was sharing a prayer that an older woman had delivered in his church, which was, I pray that the things we're being forced to do today are things we choose to do tomorrow. And I think what restaurants were either forced to do in changing, or restaurants just naturally did because that's who they was no longer about headlines or ego or aspirations for perfection. It was just about, well, A, doing whatever it took to stay alive.
Yep.
But B, doing it in a way that gave so many people who felt such a profound destabilized effect from all that was happening a sense of normalcy, a little bit of joy, a bit of connection, and kind of honestly gave them something to look forward to.
Right.
I think when you look at the people like me that do this for a living, we chose to be in the hospitality business because there's nothing that energizes us more than seeing the look of complete joy on someone's face when they receive a gift that we're responsible for giving them. I think the restaurants that made it were those that wanted to give other people gifts, but honestly, they just missed the gift of giving. And they needed to be creative to figure out how to continue to do that.
The cocktail boxes, the fried chicken and waffles. That's we saw a lot of that, like drive up and pick up your joy.
Which was not just a way to survive. It was also a way for so many people in my industry to get back to doing the thing that they loved, which was making other people happy. And I think the beautiful thing that happened, one of the main points I talk about, like one of the secret ingredients of unreasonable hospitality, is you need to take what you do seriously without taking yourself too seriously, because too often in customer service organizations, and honestly, even as individuals, we let these self-imposed standards, these kind of arbitrary brands that we build stand in the way of us giving the people around us the thing that will actually make them happy. During COVID, people didn't have the ability to take themselves too seriously, right? We were just throwing things at the wall to see what stuck. And the restaurants that thrived were the ones that just did things because they felt awesome and they felt like they would make people happy. And I think when you talk about like choosing to do the things we were forced to do, now coming out of COVID, okay, the world's kind of found its new normal, but people have now gained the perspective to know how important that sense of connection is. And whether it's going to a restaurant or your dentist's office or to the local auto body shop, the places that can give them that sense of true belonging, make them feel welcome, are going to be the places that flourish going forward.
So I have two things. The first one, I want to back us up a little bit to make sure that we have some clarity about your terminology. And then I want to talk a little bit about the conflicting truths that you talk about throughout the book. I think that's a theme in the book. And I'm just saying that out loud so I don't forget. So the first one is we've already talked about service versus hospitality. But then you level up again in this book by talking about going above hospitality to unreasonable hospitality. So can you define for us what I believe that you say in the book that the opposite of unreasonable hospitality is reasonable hospitality? It's not the opposite. It's not bad service. It actually is a level up. So how did unreasonable hospitality come to you? Why is it the name of the book? And how did you use that as sort of a North Star for much of your decision making?
So, yeah, I mean, it was something I read by a guy named Rory Sutherland, that the opposite of a good idea, or a great idea, needs to be a good idea. That's why there's such power in unreasonable hospitality, because the opposite is still fine, right? Like if the title of the book was Good Hospitality, okay, the opposite of that is bad hospitality. That's not a strategy, right? It's pretty obvious which one you need to pursue. Whenever you're pursuing an idea, if the opposite of that idea is still good, it means you're actually pursuing something that has the capacity to be great. Those words came into my head because the first time my restaurant was invited to London, because we'd been added to the list of the 50 best restaurants, we went to London, all excited.
Story, yep.
Yeah, and this is how the book starts. And this is how it works. When you go to that ceremony, you know that when you attend the awards, you are one of the 50 best restaurants in the world. You just don't know where on the list you fall until you get there. And so we get there and we had assigned seating, and I was trying to guess based on where we were sitting relative to where some of our heroes were sitting, where we'd fall. I guessed, I think, number 35. My partner, I was a bit more optimistic, guessed 25. And then the thing started. And I'm sure there was some, opening remarks or dramatic effects, but I don't remember much before they said, kicking off the list at number 50, a new entry from New York City, 11 Madison Park. We'd come in dead last.
Just over the bar.
Yeah, just got it. And I reacted like anyone who was pretty disappointed would. I kind of like balled over, like I'd just been kicked in the groin. Now, I very quickly realized, and this is something I would never have known since it was the first year we were there and we were the first restaurant that was called, is they give you assigned seating so that they can train the camera on you when your name is called and project your image in front of like the room.
Should have learned from the Oscars.
I realized that, tried to muster a smile and a wave, but it was too little too late. I did what anyone would do in a moment of profound disappointment. I grabbed my partner. We left the party early. We went back to the hotel and we started drinking whiskey. We got angry for a while. I think that's appropriate. I think anytime you're served a good dose of disappointment, you should give yourself the space to be angry about it until you ultimately get over that and start to look at it with a clearer perspective. What is this telling me? What can I learn from it? The reality is we were on that list because we were a great restaurant. We were a really, really great restaurant. Our food was really delicious, very innovative. Our service was as close to technically perfect as possible. Our room, as I said, was beautiful. But that list, okay, it's patently absurd for one restaurant to be called the best restaurant in the world. Right. What the list acknowledges is the restaurant that's having the greatest impact on the world of restaurants. When I looked at the restaurants that had come before us, they made an impact. When I looked at us, we hadn't. Mm-hmm. Now, that night, my dad, when I was a kid, he gave me this paperweight that said, what would you attempt to do if you knew you could not fail? His whole thing growing up was too many people are scared to answer that question honestly for fear that if they do and they don't achieve it, they'll let themselves and everyone else around them down. Mm-hmm. But I was thinking about that paperweight that night when we wrote on a cocktail napkin, we will be number one. I've always been of this belief that if you don't have the confidence to actually say your most audacious goals out loud, you'll never achieve them. But I didn't want to be number one just for the accolade. I wanted to be number one for the impact. The restaurants that had come before us were unreasonable with the food they were serving. And they changed the game. There was a restaurant in Spain that pioneered something called molecular gastronomy, a restaurant in Copenhagen that pioneered local cuisine and foraging for ingredients. And those chefs were completely unreasonable in pursuit of changing the food that was being served, evolving technique, like really revolutionizing the craft. I decided that I wanted to be unreasonable in pursuit of the one thing that would never change, which is the human desire to feel seen, to feel a sense of belonging. I wanted to be unreasonable in pursuit of how we made people feel. Mm-hmm. I had a thesis that if we could be just as relentless, just as persistent, be willing to do whatever it took to give people the greatest hospitality they'd ever experienced, that's where we could evolve our craft. And 7 years later, we were number one.
So let's talk a little bit about what took you to get there, which is the arc of the book relies on this journey in many ways. It's not the only story here, but it does follow the arc. And I think what's interesting, what I was going to bring up based on a previous answer was that you are I'm going to say self-described perfectionist or obsessive, or you have a very particular drive for excellence on the particular level, right? You're very particular. But a lot of the work a lot of the innovation that you created in your restaurant is almost the antithesis of that, in the sense that it freed guests in the main, but also your staff up for riffing a little bit, doing some decision making, giving guests the power to decide what it was that they wanted to eat, improvising when you wanted to make an impact on a guest that was beyond the food. And so that's a sense of giving up control, right? Like once you bring people into the mix and what they want, then, that can drive a controlling person crazy, because yes, you want uniformity and you want predictability. And so this, to me, was one of the themes that comes from the book is this tangling of two truths. And you're very explicit in some of the lessons that you share, that is something that you're comfortable with and something that you like to do, whether it's how you run the restaurant versus the experience that the guests have. So tell us a little bit about how you came to live with both of those truths of being relentlessly pursuing excellence, but also it being about people who are notably unpredictable.
Yeah. No, that was well articulated, because I do have a lifelong conflict between control and trust, which there's like these conflicting goals, right? And Roger Martin, an amazing writer, talks all about conflicting goals and the power of embracing them. Excellence and hospitality are conflicting goals. Control and trust are conflicting goals. And they all kind of mean the same thing. Listen, I talk about unreasonable hospitality. That's the name of the book. It's not me saying that supplants excellence. You need to have a foundation of excellence such that you can build this tower of unreasonable hospitality on top of it. Mm-hmm. I think for me, it was like a series of revelations. What I said before about how a restaurant, the food, the service, and the design are simply ingredients in the recipe of human connection, I didn't realize that right away. It took me time to realize it.
That's that journey.
That's the journey. I had been so focused on excellence. When you want to become the best at most things, and I don't know most things, many things, excellence is it, right? Like, but it wasn't until I realized that at the end of the day, like, it doesn't matter how good the food is, it doesn't matter how good the service is. If the people we're serving don't feel a genuine connection to us, those that are serving them, and to one another, then we're not actually a good restaurant. Mm-hmm. And actually, I don't think I'm any less of a perfectionist than I always was. I think I just started to redefine the word perfect in the context of what we were trying to do. I still, by the way, am maniacal in my OCT tendencies about all the things that have nothing to do with connection, because I actually do. Someone said it the other day to me, like, symmetry lowers the heartbeat. And the more details that we can control and make perfect, such that when we're in service, when the night begins, we don't have to think about all that stuff. It's all exactly the way that it's meant to be. And we can transition to being fully present with people. And then doing the things that, I mean, we'll tell stories in a little bit, but a lot of the things that we did go above and beyond for people, the things that turned it from an ordinary transaction into an extraordinary experience, they were objectively not perfect, but subjectively they were exactly perfect.
That's great. That's a great, yes.
Like once you kind of turn that corner and you recognize, again, you're not serving your own ego, you're serving other people. Then your definition of what's perfect and what's imperfect starts to dramatically change.
I think a story that you tell that is a good illustration of that is, I think you were talking about when you were younger and you had been working in a restaurant as a server, or and you had observed two different groups of servers in the restaurant. One that was incredibly successful at turning tables over and getting their work done, and another that, again, might subjectively seem less efficient, less successful by metrics, but ended up actually making a lot more money for both the restaurant and for themselves. And I think that's what you're getting at there, that there's that excellence, even if it doesn't suit the metrics, one set of metrics is excellent meeting another set of metrics.
Yes. Yeah, no, the story you're telling is I was a intern at Tribeca Grill in New York City. And about 2 weeks into my internship, I was meant to be like the college kid in the office that got managers coffee and taught them how to use Microsoft Excel. But like 2 weeks in, a bunch of servers quit, and I ended up being a server for the first time in my life at one of New York City's busiest restaurants. And so in that moment, I did what I do anytime I'm entering into a role. I study the people that are already in the role, try to figure out who's best at it, and then study them and try to emulate everything about them. And there was this group of servers, and they were like Keanu Reeves in The Matrix. I mean, they were so good. They could look at their station at any one moment and tell you who's on dessert, who just ordered, who's waiting for a check. That person's been waiting too long for their entree. They could just see it all and prioritize what needed to get done when in the exact right order. And because of that, they turned more tables, they served more guests. But then as I was doing the tip sheet at the end of every night, that's where the different servers give their tips and it all gets pulled together, but you see who brought in what.
Yep.
There was another group of servers that was serving less people and making more money. They weren't as efficient, but they were much more present. When I talk about being present, and it's a way overused thing these days, but in the context of hospitality, it just means caring so much about the person you're with that you stop caring about all the things you need to do. If you sat in their station, you probably waited a little bit longer than you wanted to place your order or for the check or to get your dessert or whatever. But when the person that was serving you was at your table, they were completely with you. You felt a strong connection to the person serving you, because when they were serving you, they'd stopped caring about all the other people they needed to serve next. They could spend half as much time at the table and end the night twice as connected to that table. And again, you're absolutely right to bring it up at this point in the conversation, because it was then that I redefined the word perfect.
Right.
As much as the people in the first group were more excellent, that actually wasn't perfect in the context of that job.
I think one of the things that intrigued me from a balance and business perspective in the book is when you were talking again early on, and I'll let you tell this story better than I will be able to, but you make a distinction between restaurants that are restaurant smart and restaurants that are corporate smart, or people who run them that are restaurant smart or corporate smart. And you learned early on that you wanted to be both, that there was value to be both, and you didn't have to be one or the other. So again, we have these sort of assumed to be conflicting ideas, but I think many leaders, many companies run into this conviction that you have to make a choice. Like, you can't give too much because that's going to go against the bottom line. Or, you can't care too much about the bottom line if you're going to give enough to the customer. So if you can color that story in a little bit and give us that leadership lesson that it does not have to be one or the other.
Yeah, and I'll spare the entire narrative around
it's
it.
It's good, though.
Yeah.
Everyone should read it.
Thank you. No, so most companies fall into one of those two categories. And honestly, it transcends restaurants. It's any company that has a corporate office and multiple units. It could be Avis rental car, it could be McDonald's, it could be a chain of restaurants, it could be your local Citibank branch. They're run one of two ways, and whether you're restaurant smart or corporate smart is simply defined by where the highest paid people are. Are they in the corporate office or are they on the front line? Because that choice defines how you make decisions. Are you empowering and trusting the people that are actually serving your customers and giving them the latitude and the leeway to do what is needed to make people happy? The benefits of Restaurant Smart are that, listen, like, you can walk into a place and you can feel the soul of it. Are the people just helping to execute someone else's vision, or do they have some amount of agency in terms of what they're creating? Those restaurants just tend not to be as profitable because they don't have the back-end systems, the controls that corporate smart companies do, where they have their highest paid people in the corporate office putting in guardrails and systems and policies and structure. Over time, I learned that neither approach works, because it is a business after all. And honestly, if all you care about is hospitality and the guest experience, you need to run a good business to have the resources to do that as well as you want to do it.
Yep.
And what's the point of having a good business if you're not making people happy enough? Because there will be a limited life expectancy to that business. People will eventually give up on you if your team doesn't feel empowered and the customer doesn't feel invested in. It was only over time that I learned you actually could do both. It's just walking a fine line. It's threading a needle. And Listen, in many ways, when I talk about unreasonable hospitality, I say it's not that hard. It just requires caring more and trying harder. And I actually do believe that. It's not rocket science, right? But it just requires being as intentional as you possibly can be about every single decision, where you choose to be restaurant smart, where you choose to be corporate smart, how you give trust to the people that you work with, and when you need to impose controls, when it's important to lean in on excellence, and when it's important to double down on hospitality. To just be very intentional in how you pursue all of those things, which, by the way, are all really the same thing. It's just being as intentional as possible in pursuit of relationships. Every single one of those things boils down to one or more relationships.
There's a, this book isn't just about how we create a successful business or how we treat customers. And early on, I made promises that we're going to cover lots of different layers in the book, which is what makes it so successful and such an enjoyable read. But I think if we try to slot this in as an industry book, or we try to slot this in as a leadership book, that what we're really talking about here is sort of continuous improvement, regardless of which area we're talking about. And that really, again, not just the people you serve, but the people that you employ have to join you on that quest. And there's a lot of material in here that is about you establishing relationships with the people that you work with. And whether it's peers or partners, but also the staff in the restaurant. And one of my favorite lines, I have it written down here, it's later in the book, but I think it colors the entire thing, that, quote, "When you lose the viewpoint of the people you're responsible for managing, you also tend to lose your empathy for them. We'd all be better leaders if we could tap back into what it felt like to be led." And that struck me as, I think it pulls in what you just said about where the highest earners are in a company, whether they're at the top of the company or the people on the front lines. And if we can remember how we got to where we are now, wherever that is, then we have the ability to keep that empathy alive. And that sort of unreasonable hospitality that you've talked about is not just about making a business transaction non-transactional, but it's the relationships within the business non-transactional, because that's what we run into a lot is, oh, you pay me to do X. That's what I will do.
Yes. Rather
than go above and beyond with you as a leader who is trying to drive toward excellence. And I think that it's such a valuable part of this book is that interior relationships. And if you can tell us a little bit more about how you came to value, and in some of the stories, clearly you learned late that there were times where you didn't trust as much as you should have. You didn't relinquish or delegate as early as you could have. But generally speaking, you kept the people that you work with very human.
So it's funny. One of the fun parts about this moment and my experience around this book is hearing the lines that stick out for different people. And you write a bunch of words in a book, and sometimes you hear something almost like you're hearing it for the first time, and you're the first person to pull that line out. I believe that's in the context at that point in the book about my dad encouraging me to journal. It's funny, I did a TED talk recently, and one of the other speakers the day I did it, his speech was about the importance of reflection. And he was encouraging people to create practices of reflection, which is interesting because very few people do, right? Like people have like, people have practices, like you never get good at anything if you don't make it a practice, right? You don't create a system and a rhythm through which you do it. And what he was talking about with reflection is just looking back on your day and reflecting on that day and what you can learn from that day.
Right.
My dad would always encourage me to keep a journal my entire career for two reasons. One, for that reason, so that I could reflect on the day, recognize where I wasn't my best self, so I could apologize for it the next day. His thing always was that, like, if a leader is willing to say sorry to the people that work for them, if they're willing to criticize themselves, the people that work for them will be that much more willing to receive criticism from them. And he's absolutely right.
Yes. Yep.
But he would also have me journal because he said, as I was coming up in my career, listen, if you're a server and then you become a manager and then you're a general manager, you can only hold on to the perspective you had in the position you just got promoted from for so long before it goes away and you start thinking like the position that you're in. Keeping a journal is a great way to be able to tap back into that perspective so that you can manage with empathy. If you're already far along in your career, fear not. Like, hope is not lost. You can still tap into that perspective. It just requires being intentional, spending more time talking to and trying to understand the perspectives of the people you're leading. The whole idea of hospitality, whether it's reasonable or unreasonable, is driven by one very simple thing, right? You can't expect people to know how to give it if they don't also know what it feels like to receive it. And if I want my team to go above and beyond for the people they're serving, I need to be just as willing to go above and beyond for them as well. And that doesn't mean these crazy gestures of hospitality like we did at the restaurant for the people that work for me. Sometimes it does. They should get a taste of that too. But more often, it just means doing the simple things with intention, like making sure you spend enough time with them to understand their perspective before you make a decision that happens to them. Whereas if it had been just done a little bit differently, it could have happened for them.
Great distinction.
You look at what's happening in the world right now and all these companies that are laying off all these different people. Listen, sometimes people need to make difficult decisions for the health of their company, and a leader should always do what's best for the company before they do what's best for any individual person in the company. Otherwise, they can't do what's best for any of the individuals. But it very often feels like a lot of the people at the top have so long ago lost the perspective of the people they're leading that they can't make the best decisions possible.
And I think maybe that's an extension again of that feeling like they've had to make a choice between being a corporate smart business or a whatever restaurant service company or whatever that is, like having to make these choices as opposed to being able to hold both truths at the same time. Yeah. And I think what's so great about what you said about that distinction of when things happen to people versus happening for people and just doing them slightly differently in order to achieve that really significant experiential difference. I just want to pinpoint that for the people who have yet to read the book. And I think it's very obvious to me that language is really important to you. And throughout the book, you talk a lot about communication, the value of words, the value of story. You recount winning the #1 ranking in the 50 best restaurants in the World Award that you eventually did win 7 years later. I'm not giving any spoilers. You've already said that. And the speech you gave that night, which you quote in the book, I talked about the nobility of service, the importance of naming for ourselves that the work we do is important. And then later, I'm going to pull a couple more quotes for you. Also, language is how you give intention to your intuition and how you share your vision with others. And finally, language creates culture. So clearly, words are so critical to just communicating the difference between something happening to someone or happening for someone, whether it's reasonable hospitality or unreasonable hospitality. And how did you come to that? And clearly that's what compelled you to write a book so that you can share and help people create those cultures for themselves. But I'm interested in where that real core belief in language started.
So, I mean, that was definitely one of the things I got from Danny Meyer working for him, was the power of words, right? Danny had all of these isms. And anyone who read Set on the Table can relate to this. Be the swan, charitable assumption, the salt shaker, this, that, the other thing. And like, Danny and I are different generations. We're very similar. We're very different. Like some of those, they're like a little cheesy for me. I was like a young kid, but still I was hooked to them.
Mm-hmm.
Isms are powerful, right? Like you need to have shorthand with which the people on the team can communicate ideas. And when you create simple names to describe like complicated ideas, it makes them that much easier for everyone to understand and embrace and rally behind. When I say language creates culture, it's because, listen, what you talk about is what a culture is defined by. What a leader spends the most time talking about is what everyone thinks about. And the thing that people think about the most often is what the culture ends up being. The reason language is important is two parts. One, if a leader or a team of leaders needs to take their ideas and actually articulate them in easy to understand ways, it forces them to understand what they're trying to accomplish more effectively than they probably would have understood it before they set out to do that. Honestly, even me, I've always tried to really focus on this. I am a better leader having wrote the book than I was before, because I had to really like put intention to all of my intuitions and really understand how. I know what I always say, the best way to learn is to teach, right? The moment you start to learn how to express an idea and as a teacher, you start to understand it more effectively as a student. People get to a certain point in their career, they feel like they've learned all they can learn. But honestly, even if you think that, the more you teach, the more you actually learn. And that's a beautiful thing. But also once, like anyone trying to do anything has a bunch of people that work for them. And yes, body language, nonverbal communication is so important, especially in hospitality. But at the end of the day, there are few things more powerful than the spoken word when you're trying to inspire a team. Taking the time to clearly articulate your vision, your non-negotiables, your core values, your objective, your goals, and then communicating that to your team constantly and endlessly, and at times seemingly repetitively,
right,
has a transformative impact.
I think that's such an important part of, as we said, it's a through line through the book, but it's also one of your most important lessons is this value of communication. And I believe it or not, we are nearing our end already. Even though I have, let's talk.
I'm enjoying this conversation.
Let's talk about Floyd. Let's talk about meeting energy, all of this stuff. But let's try to pick one story here that I think it exemplifies both the leadership message, but also gives that really fun industry insight that does come through in your book. And that is the pursuit of the New York Times review and what it takes for a restaurant to intentionally practice, as you said, with the journaling and all of the things that we need to do with intentionality, with practice, and how that lengthy commitment to all of that ends up paying off in a spectacular way, but in a way that is sort of like, you never know when this person's going to show up. You never know if it's going to be good, but you better know that you're good before they ever show up.
Yeah. So, in New York, the New York Times food critic has long since been what's the word I'm looking for? Anonymous. Back in the day, you didn't know who the New York Times food critic was. Sometimes they put on disguises. Now with the internet, they can't. You know who they are.
Yeah.
The thing is, it doesn't matter because a bad restaurant can't suddenly become great like the moment the critic walks in.
Mm-hmm.
It's not dissimilar to I'm known in my companies for using sports metaphors constantly for someone who actually doesn't know that much about sports, but it's not dissimilar to a football team. You can't like dial it in, game after game after game, and then suddenly become the best team when you get to the Super Bowl, right? Like you need a set of a practice. You need to decide you are going to treat every single game like the Super Bowl. When I got to 11 Madison Park, we had 2 stars. Not that long after I was there, about a year later, we got our 3rd star. Mm-hmm. And then we were pushing to try to get 4 stars, which is the most you can have. There's only a handful of restaurants in the city that have 4 stars. Finally, Frank Bruni, the food critic at the time, came in for dinner. And he had just given us 3 stars a couple years earlier. There was no reason for him to be there unless he was going to re-review us and give us 4. He came in, we freaked out. We didn't even know he was there until he was there. The maitre d' noticed him, and we tried to do everything we could to make the experience great. We thought we did a great job. We were feeling it. We were feeling ourselves hard. And then he didn't come back week after week after week. He didn't come back. Normally when a restaurant opens, they're a new restaurant, the critic comes a handful of times in a month. Mm-hmm. So you can just be on high alert and you just get it right. He came in probably 5 or I forget how many times over the course of a year, mm-hmm. which is a very long time to be
on
high alert.
Yeah. To be practicing perfection or excellence.
Yeah. But what we did was we just decided to embrace it. I talk about Michael Jordan in this part of the book because I was pretty inspired by The Last Dance, the documentary, where Michael Jordan would create stakes. Like if someone bumped into him and he didn't have anything to get him really fired up during the game, he'd pretend that the guy bumped into him on purpose so that was now his rivalry for the game. And so what we decided was we were just going to pretend that one of the tables every single night was the critic. For a year, every single night, we'd treat one table like the critic. And now, just to dispel anyone that might be thinking this, no, it's not like they got much better service than anyone else around them. In fact, it was just like being in that framework.
Right.
Deciding that night was the Super Bowl every single night. It actually ended up being the thing that over time made us worthy of 4 stars. I actually think in reflection that the first time he came in, we didn't deserve it. But by the last time he did, we did. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's an industry inside story and that I don't know how many restaurants are absurd enough to do that.
The process of getting a review, I certainly did not understand the sort of process that happens, but then just the commitment to that this is not happenstance, that we're just not going to be fantastic tonight, the night that, someone important shows up, but that it is a practice.
Yeah. And then, by the way, when he finally did come in again, after we'd been doing that for a long time, there was no freaking out. There was no flustered. We just looked at each other. We're like, just another night. Yep. Here we go.
So let's try to get one more in here. And I want to go all the way into unreasonable hospitality. And as you mentioned, as you were pursuing the trying to get the top rank of the best restaurants or most impactful restaurants, you were trying to change the game in terms of service. And you made some fairly spectacularly unusual decisions in assessing and reassessing, which I'm sad that we're not going to be able to talk about the granola, which I think is one of the best examples of reinventing a transition that is, or a tradition that needs to be looked at. But we're going to go with the big, maybe crazy ones, right? Where you said, like, we are going to deconstruct everything that's transactional about your visit to our restaurant. We're going to take away the podium for reservations. We're going to change the way you get your bill. We're going to change the way that you get your coat. We're going to like have intel on everybody who comes so we can actually like greet people by name simply because we've done research on them. We're going to invest the people, the payroll, the process, the practice to doing this highly impactful change to what hospitality is formally known to be. And if you can just give us a little bit of, I don't know, pick one of those, like getting rid of the podium for reservations and what that takes to do something like that, but why it's valuable to do.
Yeah, so there was a whole season after I wrote Unreasonable Hospitality down, and when we were in London underneath We Will Be Number One, where I didn't know what it actually meant in the beginning. And I think that's okay. Sometimes you don't need to fully understand a goal to start pursuing it, so long as you feel enough of a connection to, well, the way it makes you feel.
Right.
You know there's something there, and it'll start to reveal itself to you more clearly over time. But I do know that things that feel transactional don't feel hospitable. And so we just did like an audit for a long time. What is something that could feel transactional? And I mean, if hospitality is about making people feel welcome, then why not start at the point in the meal where people are literally welcomed, which is when they walk in the front door. I've always tried to be inspired by what it feels like when you go to a friend's house for dinner, right? At the end of the day, that's not what it is. You're going to a restaurant, but if it can have like, you know, some of that in it, I think that goes a long way. When you go to a friend's house for dinner, they throw open the door. They're like, hey, welcome. They give you a hug. They invite you in.
Yeah.
When you go to most restaurants, you walk in, there's someone standing behind a literal barrier between you and them. The person there to welcome you is standing behind something. That matters, right? It's just a physical barrier to connection. And they say, who are you?
Right.
I'm being dramatic.
Are you sure? Are you, yeah. Are you?
And then they look at a screen,
yeah.
they thumb around, and then they say, hey, take them to table 65. Again, I'm being dramatic. But what if the experience could feel more like you're coming to someone's house for dinner? And what if you walked in and it was just a person standing there and they said, hey, Will, welcome. We're so excited to have you here. Janet's going to take you to the table. They just bring you in. That would feel magical. And by the way, one of the biggest things you're trying to do to really connect with people is to get them to lower their guards. The faster people can lower their guards, you're a really good interviewer. Like you're really, really good at this. And you got me to lower my guard pretty quickly in this interview through intention. You made me feel special. You read the book. You said really kind things. I settled in. Now you're getting more of me and vice versa.
And now we could just keep going.
Now we can go all night. But like giving people a profound sense of welcome at the beginning of the meal is the best way to lower those guards as quickly as possible, which means that everyone in the dining room can really get a lot more work done when it comes to connection.
Right.
So here's the deal. That's not that hard, but it requires working really hard. I want to make a distinction between these two things. Just because you have to try a lot harder to accomplish something, it doesn't mean it's hard. It just means you have to try harder. Like biochemistry is hard right, for me. Sometimes doing amazing things, it just means that you are going to do whatever it takes to bring it to life. So to get rid of the podium, when I go through all of this, it required a second podium and a second maitre d', and the second podium's hidden around the corner, and there's sign language, and you're Googling people, and you have pictures and little pieces of paper, all this stuff. There's a quote in there by Teller of Penn and Teller, which is magic is just doing more than anyone could ever reasonably expect you could do to create a moment of magic. Raindrops make oceans. If you do enough of those little things for people, the experience can feel like pure magic.
That is the perfect way to end our interview. And we have a note for the live attendees here that you can order a copy of Will's book, which you should, because there is much more than we've been able to cover today. And I want to just add one thing to what you where you just ended. And you start the book by saying that we are responsible for making magic. I'm paraphrasing there. But I think that if there is a takeaway from the book that will get everybody inspired to apply some of the how and the why that you put into this book, it is that feeling that we are responsible for making magic for other people. And in the service industry, we have the opportunity to do that. And we should really welcome and relish that opportunity. And your book gives us a lot of brilliant ideas for how to make that real for us. So thank you very much.
Hey, thank you so much for this. And to everyone listening, I'm on the East Coast. I don't know where you all are, but it's just meaningful that you chose to give us an hour of your time. And I hope you enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody, for joining in. Well, as I said, we'll have a recording for you so you can share it with other people after the event. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Have a great night.